Welcome, everyone. We'll just give it a minute and let everybody get in. Hi there, Pauline.
Hello. Hi, everybody.
Hello. Welcome, everyone. We are just giving it one minute to let everybody get into the webinar. Okay, let's get started. So thank you so much for joining us today, or perhaps joining us again today, or perhaps this is the first time that you're joining the series. My name is Shannon Ganem, and I'm the Global Education Director at Magnum Photos. And with my colleague, Pauline Vermeer, Cultural Director at Magnum Photos New York, we are your hosts for the Beyond Magnum series. Beyond Magnum is an in-depth talks program created to explore some of the challenges facing our industry today. Through this series of free talks in chapters addressing archives, representation, and the future of photography, speakers will share thoughts and engage in debate across a range of issues. Each section will be led by respected figures from the world of photography, and speakers will range from practitioners to academics to subjects of photographs. Recordings from Chapter 1 archives can be found on the Beyond Magnum page and on the Magnum Photos YouTube channel. And you can hear more from our president, Olivia Arthur, about the aims of the program in the first session. So some housekeeping before we kick off. Today's event is being hosted via Zoom webinar. You'll be able to participate via the Q&A box. So please put in any comments, feedback, questions for our speakers, or technical questions. We recognize that this series of events will likely raise more questions than answer them, and that it is the beginning of a conversation. So we thank you for your contributions to that dialogue. You'll be seeing more from us following this program as to how we plan to take that dialogue forward for us as an agency and as part of a wider industry. With that, I will hand over to chapter co-chair Anthony Luvera, who with Noel Flores-Terrad has curated the conversations in this chapter on representation and self-representation. So thank you to Anthony and Noel for that. And I'll also ask Susan Meiselas and Laura Wexler to join us. Welcome, Susan and Laura.
Thank you very much, Shannon. And I'm delighted to be here today with Susan Meiselas and Laura Wexler to discuss collaborations, a potential history of photography. And I'm certain that both Susan and Laura perhaps need no introduction, but just to remind ourselves of the extraordinary contribution to the photographic medium that they've both made. I'll read a little from their bios. Susan Meiselas is a documentary photographer and member of Magnum Photos since 1976. She is the author of Carnival Strippers, Nicaragua, Kurdistan in the Shadow of History, Pandora's Box, Encounters with the Dani, and A Room of Their Own. She has co-edited 2 collections, El Salvador, work of 30 photographers, and Chile from Within. Meiselas is well known for her documentation of human rights issues in Latin America. Her photographs are included in American and international collections. She is presently the president of the Magnum Foundation. The Magnum Foundation supports, trains, and mentors the next generation of in-depth documentary photographers and seeks to increase the impact of both historical and contemporary photography. Laura Wexler writes about the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, class, and nation within photographic cultures of the United States. She holds a PhD in English and Comparative Literature from Columbia University and has taught at Amherst College, Trinity College, Wesleyan University, and Peking University. She is currently Professor of American Studies, Film and Media Studies, and Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Yale. She is the author of Tender Violence, Domestic Visions in an Age of US Imperialism, co-author of Pregnant Pictures, co-editor of Interpretation and the Holocaust, and the Puritan Imagination in 19th Century America, as well as many essays, book chapters, and exhibitions, including most recently work on Roland Barthes and Keiji Nakazawa, and on the photographs of Pablo Delano, Frederick Douglass, Latoya Ruby Fraser, Jim Goldberg, Laurie Novak, Roman Vishniak, Joanne Walters, and Donovan Wiley. She is also founding director of the Photographic Memory Workshop at Yale, a founding member of the steering committee of the Feminist Technology Network, FemTechNet, and a member of the Photogramma Project, which has received NEH and ACLS support to make a web-based interactive research system for visualizing the more than 170,000 photographs created by the Farm Security Administration and Office of War Information between 1935 and 1945. So I'm delighted to have you both here to speak about collaborations, a potential history of photography. And in reflecting on the whole kind of notion of collaboration, it seems to me that the creation of a photograph typically involves technical, methodological, and conceptual processes that proceed from the conception of an idea or the depiction of a point of view through to the resolution of a finished artifact or for circulation in specific contexts. And while part of the problem of the still photograph, the fraction of a second, can result in the obfuscation of these preparatory phases and the contribution and labor of individuals involved in the process of production, not least the subject of the image, they're often further suppressed to give way to the aesthetic and representational concerns that pitch in favor of the authorship claim of the photographer or artist. And collaboration is a word which is increasingly used to describe ways of working with photography today. Recently, while I was writing about the ways the term collaboration are often used in photography for the second issue of Photography for Whom, I couldn't help but reflect on how collaboration, much like the term community, is a fickle word. It seems to me that it can be applied to many kinds of relationships, situations, and methods, often without an exactitude underpinning its use. And while it might be usually stated or implied that a collaborative practice can redress the power balance at play during the production of a photograph, I think it would be a mistake to automatically presume that this is absolutely true or a good thing in and of itself. And so one of the things that I really appreciate about collaborations, a potential history of photography, is how in attempting to define the term collaboration, the framework of the research project broadens out understandings, plural, of collaboration in a number of specific directions, rather than limiting one definition of collaboration to purely positivist terms. So to kick off, perhaps we might begin by hearing a little more about how the Collaborations project started up and evolved. And would you mind walking us through the specific vocabulary of the project, please?
Okay, well, that was a lot to begin to think about, Anthony. I guess I'm going to share my screen and the idea of walking through, and I'll also tell you a little bit about if I were to say it's a historical, it feels historical to some of us because we've been in this process for some time. So this actually began as a conversation between Wendy Ewald and myself after a kind of breakfast conversation. And it was, where did our own thinking about collaboration begin? And we were trying to trace the influences of either what we had seen or read or thought or felt, and moving that conversation then to the next stage with Ariella Azoulay, who we both independently met, Wendy in Tel Aviv, and we began to work with Ariella when she was still in Tel Aviv before she moved to Brown University. And Ariella, of course, with the most ambitious, was to take on the whole history of photography, not just the particular histories we were coming from, which had generated the conversation. So Ariella encouraged us to begin to dig, and that is what we have been doing, digging and having this conversation rippling out ever since. And I would just say that I think Laura is going to pick up a bit on how we came to a manifesto and how she came to the project.
Okay, yes. So we do have a manifesto, but unlike maybe some ideas about a manifesto, it wasn't produced prospectively. It wasn't a projection of what we were going to do. It was a moment in the midst in which we understood that we were in a process of thinking through what collaboration and our collaboration meant. And as we put the ideas down, it occurred to us that this was a manifesto, and we named it a manifesto, and we have printed it, and we have handed it out, and we will also be making it available for anyone who wants it after speaking today. But in fact, when we began, this is really the point at which we began. Each of us separately found ourselves thinking about the fact that about photography, and we're not saying what it is, we're saying it's a whatever we are doing, it is always with and among other people. That was the central realization that brought us together and that has bound us together. And that's the beginning of the manifesto as well. So Susan, do you want to
I think that's great.
go on
Yeah.
to the next?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, picking up the thread, so we worked with Ariella, Wendy and I worked with Ariella in Tel Aviv and began to expand our own thinking. And that led, when Ariella came to Brown, the opportunity to work with her class. And we began to think about how to include other people's perspectives on this word collaboration, which you so aptly said, Anthony, is complex in its own construction, though it seems people understand it one way or they remember it a different way. I mean, you inevitably, somebody says, what about Vichy? It's not all great. So we wanted to have the full spectrum, and we wanted it to be as broadly geographically based projects as we could. But the project, the fundamental concept is that we would make a square. This is the first time we actually bring together with the students from Brown all the research we were doing. And you see that these grids are made of squares. And so the basic formula of our vocabulary, so to speak, is that a square is a project, one project. And within the project, there are images, there are quotes, there's a protagonist voice. It could be the photographer, and it could also be the subject. So there's an interplay, and right from the concept, each square is different based on what it might have, the voices it might have included in the work itself. So we created grids, and I guess the important thing about this is actually the moment I remember Laura being very present, so I'll let her also comment about what this gathering engendered. December 2013, our first conversation, I think was 2009. So it took several years even to get to a public moment of inclusion.
Yeah,
Laura,
but the moment, oh, are you going to show this first?
well, I'll show it while you're talking and just.
Okay, so the moment of inclusion, this is when I became included. And as I think you can see from this, we were impressed by the intensity of the participation of this wide variety of people that included practitioners and teachers and writers and students and graduate students. And we stayed there for hours and looked at these grids that were on the wall that were produced by the research from the students and Wendy and Ariella and Susan at Brown. And we all had Post-its, and people would write on the Post-it and they would say, no, not this, or this belongs here, or this, you forgot this. And I think nobody had really expected the degree of engagement, which was a sign of a degree of urgency to rethink the history of the way photography works that we had been taught. This is, I think, what everybody felt when, just as we said in the manifesto, whatever we all realize, whatever we're doing with photography, we're doing it with and among other people. Everybody else felt the same way as well. And those other people were not in the history of photography as it is generally taught. This is the core of the project. So what happened after that was that we generated 8 different kinds of collaboration. So Anthony, as you introduced us, you were saying it's not always a simple thing. It's like plucking the feathers off of the bird. There's lots and lots of these feathers, and we have identified 8 of them. We've called them cluster texts, and they introduce 8 different clusters, or those grids that you saw on the wall at Aperture. These cluster texts are evocative. I thought of them as kind of fragments of poems rather than kind of dictionary definitions or textbook methods. And this was the first one that I fell in love with, despite the fact that multiple individuals are involved in the practice. It's the history and theory have been written as a story of single heroes and photographers. The photographed person was always there. What does that mean? If the history and theory and our sense of the history of photography is involved with the single heroes, the photographers, what does this uncanny intuition and observation that the photographed person was always there mean? This was the sentence that pulled me into the project. The photographed person was always there. And that's the way these cluster texts and then the clusters themselves are meant to work. They are by no means definitive. They are deeply researched, and many, many layers of thought have gone into them, but they are provocative and evocative. And we have gathered sometimes 9, sometimes 12, sometimes 15 projects under sort of the sign of each one of these 8 forms of collaboration. You'll also see that we've left blank squares because we want to really signify that this is not finished, this is begun, and this is an invitation to the others that we are all with to continue the project. So this is what cluster 1 looks like.
And we could just highlight, Stieglitz and O'Keeffe, Curtis, Edward Curtis, countering Pulau. I mean, you might, just these are very different. Araki, you can't see them all, Sidibe, but all of these are inclusive relationships. And what was the relationship? It's opening up the question of what were these relationships photographically? Should we go to?
Yeah,
the second one. Go ahead, Laura.
So the photographer seeks to reshape the traditional authorial position through the photographed person's collaboration. Anthony, you know a lot about this. This is some of the ways that people have thought about the notion of collaboration in the potential of photography. But there's many ways that this works out. So in cluster 2, we have gathered a bunch of projects. Susan, do you want to show cluster 2?
Yeah, this is actually an early version of cluster 2. It's even grown since then, but you can see we highlighted in that circle Jim Goldberg because he was a primary reference in that period of the 80s. So Wendy and I both were noting it. It's also where both of us have projects initially. In both of us in the 70s. So we're looking at, you can see Adam and Ollie, that you must know that project, Anthony, from Cuba, in which, yes, the shutter release is given to the subject. You can see the project of Eugene Richards, Exploding into Life with Dory, his writing partner. Anyway, we can't go over every detail, but just to give you a feeling. So this was a very important early project to identify. What did it mean that the hand of the subject was on the image itself? So this was a very primary project. And as we represented, it's not just the subjects, it's also what Jim understood he was doing at the time. And just to keep us moving. Take on iconization.
Yeah, so another cluster is iconization is preceded by collaboration. Collaboration is potentially iconoclastic. As a scholar, the scholarship on the idea of photography and an icon is mostly celebratory. that photographs can function as symbolic centers in which a society can see itself mirrored, that a photograph becomes an icon. And much of the scholarship is about how does a photograph become an icon. But when you back up and you look more broadly, you see that there are many kinds of people and ways of working that have to fit together, that have to be collaborative for there to be an icon. And that it is not necessarily a celebratory thing, that that becoming an icon actually, it's maybe different social groups want that to happen, or different scholars think it's a good idea, but for the people, something that's welcome. And when, as we have here with a migrant mother, when you add all of those voices together, you start to kind of exceed the bounds of the ways that scholarship has conceived of iconization. And you start seeing the different power relations inside even the production of a single icon. So that's what happened with Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother. It happened so much that everybody involved kept saying, I'm tired of this, Lange and Florence Owen Thompson. But what are they tired of? That's our question. What is it? How does this function? I'm tired of being a symbol of human misery. Okay, she didn't ask me, she didn't send me a copy, she never did. I'm tired of the way society has turned me into an icon. And we have found a lot of different opinions about what it means to be turned into an icon. This is only one of them. So they cluster under that cluster text. Iconization is. So as you can see, this is a way of putting things together and looking at the relationships that are generated under a sign by the juxtaposition of elements.
And I would just add that in that earlier slide, some of you might have recognized, aside from Dorothea Lange, the early cluster also has Steve Mccurry and the famous image of the green eyes, and of course how she migrates to National Geographic and how he goes back and finds her. And then, you know, as an example, I mean, we also have Che, who has his own history, different kind of history, and Lee Rayford, who isn't on our call because we couldn't get all 5 of us together on this, but you know, Lee Rayford's done a lot of work with Kathleen Cleaver and how Kathleen Cleaver has watched herself be portrayed by multiple photographers over time. So just to move along, cluster 4, potentializing violence. Do you want to again set this up?
This is the one. Yeah, well, this is the one that bothered me. I mean, I first read it as, what is the potential of violence? How can we use violence? And that I found upsetting. But I was teaching, but we didn't go through the whole process of how this developed. But after I came on the project, Ariella and I started co-teaching a graduate course on collaboration between Yale and Brown. And one of the students who had grown up in a refugee camp in Africa got extremely excited by this cluster title and text. And listening to her, what I understood was that the violence that happened in her country and to her family had happened, and there wasn't any way of undoing that. And, you know, it was of no use that this horrible, there's no saving potential from the violence that happened. But the fact that it happened, recorded or investigated by photography, made it possible in her mind to do something beyond the violence with the violence that had happened to her. And when I watched her react to this cluster, I began to understand what it means. Okay, so spectators' active engagement is necessary for releasing these situations from the violence in which they are encased. This begins to get at the idea of a potential history as well. This is called collaboration, a potential history of photography. And it's not a consecutive history. It's not a history that teaches practitioners or students, you know, what are the bases, uncover them so we know what happened in the span of the history. This is a photography to meet the needs of the future. What is the potential of photography to help us think about who we need, what we need, how we need to be in the future? So in potentializing violence, you see a struggle with Garanger to think about his own role in the violence of the Algerian War as a soldier, you know, under orders of the French, to photograph Algerian women unveiled. And he talks about that as a trauma for them and for him. He chose to obey the orders. He felt that he was, as an enlisted person, forced to collaborate. But nonetheless, it was very disturbing. And so so they were forced to be photographed by him. So years later, he actually went back with the albums to the groups of people, and together with children and grandchildren, the women he had photographed and assaulted really were able to take into their hands his photographs and discuss the experience with other people, their children and their grandchildren. And to him, this was in part remediative. What you're seeing are struggles under every single one of these cluster texts. There are people trying to figure out what it means to collaborate under the idea that the photographed person is always there, or that you can potentialize the violence in some way. People are struggling to figure this out, and it's exciting to see the different solutions. We don't all necessarily agree with the solutions or agree that they worked, but what we do see is that every one of these 8 terms is something around which people are trying to understand what the potential of the history of photography is.
Yeah. And I just wanted to go back to this grid because even though this is an early grid, I think some people would recognize the project of Donna Ferrata, you know, very important at the time that she did that work about domestic violence, the Polaroid camera, how it was used specifically in South Africa for the passports and identity cards. There's a project by about TAMS 10, which is when photographers are invited. Lori Jo Reynolds created this project, but there are many, many volunteers who are contributing by making photographs for prisoners who are in solitary. It's called Photo Requests from Solitary. So we're looking at very different kinds of obligations and volunteer actions to collaborate in this. Okay. Moving to cluster 5, Laura.
When a community is at stake, again, one of these fragmentary, elusive, poetic evocations. When a community is, what happens? How does one work with photography when the well-being and flourishing of a community is at stake? And what we've tried to find are projects that people have thought very deeply about this, and that here's one from the cluster of Zanelli Muholi, when a community is at stake. You know, that Zanelli was working with lesbian and gay and transgender people in her community. They were being killed. And Zanelli Muholi believed that honorific photographs should be made, and that these people who were in danger of expressing their being in the world should be seen, should see themselves in portraits like this, should collaborate, should be able to collaborate, should be able to direct these portraits. She understands herself as an activist before she understands herself as a photographer. And she is talking, she then was very moved about what happens in the face-to-face confrontation between herself as photographer, activist, and the many lesbians, women, and trans men I have interacted with from different places. So when a community is at stake became one of Zanelli Maholi's guiding understandings of what she was doing with photography. These were not clients, these were not projects of hers. She understood that this community was in danger and that working with photography in some way could potentialize, could make something more of the danger than simply the danger they were in. I don't know how.
Yeah, I mean, I was just looking back at the
The
square.
project is her effort to do something, yeah, for
Yeah,
that.
and actually, you know, her database was stolen and destroyed,
Yeah.
and you know, soon
Yeah.
after she did that initial work, even though the photographs traveled in different circles, as you know, Anthony. I mean, in museums and onward into books and other forms. Sometimes we're focusing on those various forms and integrating those into the representation of the square along with the images and the text. I just wanted to point to a few others. I mean, on the left of the circle in red, you see an African alphabet that Wendy did with a group of students. Obviously, there are other projects that are now part of this. Latoya's project in Braddock. We have a project called Casa Susana, in which it's a trans community that has, they call themselves cross-dressers at the time, and they're photographing themselves, protecting this collection of work was discovered only relatively recently. There's also a project from Tokyo right above that red circle you can't see very well, after the tsunami, in which a vast number of volunteers internationally online began to work and in trying to save the photographs that were held by various families. So there are lots of different ways of thinking about this, who's the community and who participates. So Laura.
Photography preserves sovereign history as incomplete. So this one is also really interesting to me because it describes my own things that happened to me as a researcher. That what I understand as a historical narrative is overturned and made incomplete by the discovery of a photograph. And it could be just a very unremarkable vernacular image that says, you know what, you guys don't know the whole thing that happened here. Photography, one of the ways that photography works is to collaborate with the future and to preserve the potential of undermining the powers that be and the stories they tell. This is a profound, visceral experience when this happens. And it's, as we know, sovereign regimes like to use photographs as what I used to say in my teaching as the stamp on the envelope. Says, yes, and this happened, and we stamp it and we show that we can, this will fly. Well, not necessarily. And a form of collaboration is of the photograph with the future, even if it doesn't have the ability to undermine sovereign injustice at the moment. So here are some of the examples, and one of the interesting ones to me are the Carte of Sojourner Truth on the bottom right-hand square. Sojourner Truth started having carte de visite made of herself. She sold these in order to earn the money to keep going. But I've been recently reading Elizabeth Siegel's work on the history of the carte de visite, and I've realized even more the kind of almost pranksterish assertion of Sojourner Truth that she belongs in the Carte de Visite album, because these are albums of friends, acquaintances, and famous people. And people would make these albums of their friends and family, and they would put famous people in to raise their status. And here, these are not, I mean, she could have had other kinds of photographs made. She's having carte de visites to imply that she belongs with the rest of the luminaries and the kin in the carte de visite album of the American middle class at this time. It's really a provocation. It's really, as she often so brilliantly did, is a real kind of skewer. She's skewering the society of her time, and she's using her representation on a specific kind of photograph to do that. This is an example of the kind of research that we've done. This is when we have tasked ourselves to put these squares together, which has taken us many years and many days of working together. What we found is that we get sent off to find other contexts, to find other voices than we had expected, and bringing them in. So the history of the Carte de Visite album makes the project glow in a different way than it had before. That's the excitement to us.
Yeah.
Co-archiving, yeah. Susan, why don't you do this?
Well, no, I mean, I'm concerned about our time, but we wanted everyone to get a sense of what these thematics are, that the so-called squares or projects are grouped into. The co-archiving might be easier. This is where my Kurdistan project is, for example, but there are many other projects. Hank Willis Thomas has a project which I always found fascinating called Studio X. I don't know how well known it is in his oeuvre. Basically a t-shirt factory in Florida where everyone is honored. Somebody is honored after their death with a t-shirt being made and held and carried. So it's another kind of an archive than the archive I was. There's also one on the FMLN archive that was done by the Salvadorian guerrillas that has been Waleed Rod's Atlas Group. I mean, these just are some examples. The richness of the range that we're trying to bring together. Cluster 8, the sovereign and civil potential of the apparatus, I think, that seems sort of obvious. I mean, we're moving from various aspects of the apparatus. As you can see, you have Cindy Sherman. Is she collaborating with herself? Does she belong in another grid, or is she, in fact, it is the camera? What is this camera doing? Or the secret cameras that the hidden mothers, which is another kind of project where the apparatus of the making of the photograph is revealed. So just to move along, I think what I wanted to pick up was when we move from this lab environment and this research environment online to then have the opportunity to formalize it. And it goes right back to what you were talking about this morning, Anthony, at Whitechapel. What does it mean? This is the Ryerson Gallery in Toronto. It was a terrifying opportunity. We chose to take it because we had a great partner with that institution. I think a really fundamental question is, how do institutions create environments where others can participate? There were obviously a vast network of faculty and other students. You can see clearly that there were just magnets on the wall. The squares are about 24 inches by 24. This is the grid configuration. And, the gray then represents, in fact, in order to put them on the walls, the gray represents someone who said, my project is not about collaboration. So we acknowledge that something we perceived as was not accepted by them. So it indicates that our own research is in a continuous dialogue. And then another stage of the dialogue is this notion of the box, which is present on the table and then moves to the floor. People move around the cluster, the squares within the grid that can move to different grids. So we've had active participation with the labs through the box, and our dream is to find the funds to produce the box along with the project that we're rather deeply immersed in now, is going from these labs. This is again Ryerson, in which people contribute now, not just with Post-it notes, but actually doing the research and bringing to us projects that they believe should be part of the lexicon of the book. And as we move to book form, which is kind of in itself, counterintuitive for our process, because the idea that Thames and Hudson is going to, in a year or two's time, bring all of this together. And as we said, I think Laura said 120 projects in 8 clusters, with the feeling that there will be blanks and many more things to come in the future that will not be included. Our ongoing conversations are via Zoom. We're constantly going backwards in order to go forwards. It's not a fixed object until it's going to be bound. And then, of course, we want to dream the box, because we want to share it beyond what books can do in environments where dialogues can continue. And I think we're just almost at the end. Do you want to read a section of this, Laura? Because I thought it's kind of, the bottom is really speaks, the top or the bottom one speaks to what I think our principal intentions are. To create a structure and open foundation for the dynamic study and display of collaboration. For now, the unified format, different squares composed in grids, arranged in clusters on the wall, enables a certain modularity that inspires conversations with different collaborators. Movable, the different squares can gain different meanings, as when squares about consent, for instance, are juxtaposed with coercive forms of collaboration, and with non-imperial ones or truly radical projects that are intended to change the conditions under which the common world is an object of care. Just seeing that and imagining when it's on a wall, your eye is going across and about, like kind of like those little games of the spelling games. I don't know what they were called in your hand. You're constantly seeing interactions on the wall. Completely different challenge when you have a linear format of a book. So we are very much in the midst of that. Do you want to read the last, a little section from the last?
Yeah,
Laura?
and to end, we're still asking after all these years, what is collaboration? We want to explore it in small scale between individuals, families, and between friends, as well as in larger scale, such as between groups of interested people who share the same profession or neighborhood. And I think probably most importantly to me, the squares and grids are ways of asking questions.
So
I
I think we're going to end just with this slide. And I'm sorry, I can't control, it's not an iPhone, I can't control that sound. It's no doubt scam or spam. Anyway, the manifesto's on the wall. I think the important thing here is that the books are on the table. And once again, when we showed this in Ryerson, I think it was important. We chose one square, it was Jim Goldberg's square, and we exploded it into an exhibition space. So his entire project of Rich and Poor was in one room. So you understand a square is a highly compressed form to really hint at and open up the questions that we think can be engaged with, basically.
Yeah, and when we showed it in Philadelphia, we had a room of film. And when we showed it in New Haven, the art space in New Haven commissioned local artists to make projects in conversation with the collab project. So as you can see, we don't think of this as having answers, but watching people try to come up with answers and inviting more people to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's a walkthrough. It's hard, it's dense, and I hope we gave people a sense of what's included and also what may be excluded that still could be included, because we're still in a working process, a very open process, and thinking about how it will continue in book form onward.
Susan and Laura, that was such an incredibly rich and wonderful overview of the project. And one of the things that really strikes me about the Collaborations project and the collaboration between the 5 of you is how it serves as a pedagogical tool. and has developed through pedagogical spaces that you're all involved in the various kind of institutions that you teach in. And so on the one hand, I'm thinking about the sort of the pedagogical aspect of it, the participative aspect of it, in terms of how audiences come and enable you to continue to kind of keep asking that question together and with audiences, what is collaboration? But I'm also interested in this sort of, I don't know, it seems to me that this is essentially a feminist practice. And it reminds me of the sort of visual literacy projects of the 1970s, certainly here in Great Britain, in the UK, where you know, people working with photography were kind of really interested in exploring the potential of photography and the potential of collaborative spaces through pedagogy as a way to raise critical consciousness. So I suppose I'm really curious about your own experience of education and the context of being women in the 1970s feminist movement. Could you speak a little more about that?
Wow. Well, Laura, where do you want to begin on that one? So Laura and I have the accidental truth of having gone to the same college, though we knew each other somewhat then at the same time, but really came together 25 years later to discover that we both had taken paths towards and in and around photography. And that it took 25 years to discover that is kind of half the time since we were in college. So that's kind of a shocker in itself. But I don't know, do you want to, I mean, I did really begin in a classroom. I didn't see myself as a photographer initially. I loved the idea of photography enabling interaction and engagement in the world. And that's, you know, that's sort of really my roots, and I think evolved into photography and trying to wrestle with the power relations that were endemic, that right from the beginning discomforted me. This feeling of trespassing, etc. Who am I and what am I doing? What am I contributing has always been the premise of trying to resolve that sense of inequality. And some of the points that you made earlier about, you know, what does it mean to be the author of? I mean, I can remember the Nicaragua book and my name being equal in size, the font size on the cover of the Nicaragua book, and saying, no, you've got this really out of balance here, yeah. You know. So, you know, you're taking on those questions for yourself, and yet everything you do has to take on that question and recreate spaces. I mean, even to the point that the Nicaragua book looks like a fixed form in a book, going back 10 years later to find the people in the photographs, pictures from revolution, is much more important to me as a maker to understand, what did I make? What happened with what I made, both for the history within Nicaragua and then in an ongoing way, other artists working with the work, reappropriating the work, all of this. So it's a, you know, we could go on and on. I'll let Laura respond in her own way.
Okay. Yeah, Anthony, you're completely right. It's a feminist project. We didn't sit around the table and say, okay, let's write a feminist history of photography. I'm not actually sure anyone but feminists would write this history of photography, given the 10 years it's taken of our collaborative work. But why? Okay, so if you go back to the precepts of feminist teaching in the late 60s, early 70s, when I actually was in London also, one of the ideas that was always very important to me is that everyone around the table has something to say. That is the guiding point of my teaching still. So not your own hierarchy of who you as a teacher or you as another student think are the important ones to listen to, but everyone at that table has something important to say. And when you take that and you overlay that onto how we have been taught what photography is, you see that there's a lot of scope for further questions about all those people around the table. That's in a nutshell what we have been doing. Susan and I and Wendy are of a particular generation, and Lee and Ariella are somewhat younger than they're the next generation. Susan and Wendy and I were the first cohort into these prestigious institutions. We had entry, but not access. In other words, we were invited in, but the idea wasn't that we were going to change the way things were done. The idea was that we were going to learn how things were done, which was the assumption was we didn't know. we couldn't work, we couldn't function that way. I think if you went to our entire generation, you would find that we evolved separately and together this process of working with other people, partly because the institutions didn't really want to work with what we knew, which was that everyone around the table has something to say. So you are right that this is a feminist project. We have recognized it, but we recognized it midway. We didn't, it is who we are. It wasn't a program that we had to institute.
Well, it's really striking to me. And I think, one of the other things that's also striking to me is that Wendy Ewald, in many respects, may be thought of as one of the sort of really founding individuals that kind of instigated the community photography movement here in Britain. But that's a whole other conversation. I mean, Laura, in your kind of work as an art historian, as a thinker and writer on photography, I'm really interested in how the Collaborations project, in many respects, both through its research process, its method of analysis, and its the kind of critical framework for rethinking a potential history for photography, in many respects is a provocation or a challenge or a rebuttal to traditional or established methods used in art historical accounts, and in many respects has more of a kind of an embodiment of the interdisciplinarity and self-reflexivity, which is so highly kind of pronounced in the field of visual culture studies. And so I'm curious about whether or not there are any other examples of other research projects, initiatives, or approaches that were formative in the development of collaborations, or that you kind of have sort of looked towards or noted as occurring alongside collaborations.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Anthony, because my internet, even though I've got it on the highest, has been unstable. But I think I understood the question. I was at MIT in the late 60s, as a student, and the assignment to take a view camera and a tripod and a black cloth and go out into the city of Boston and come up with 3 finished photographs completely changed my life. This time, under the black cloth, watching the world walk around upside down on the glowing screen. I knew immediately, and I was fascinated by what goes on behind the camera, and the idea that you could make permanent those people walking around on that screen and then hand it later to other people. I was overwhelmed by the power and the potential of that, and I still am. And I think that all of my teaching has simply been activist teaching in that model. Put people in a situation where something like that happens. It's very different from the history of art historian, but
Laura's breaking up a little.
Not actually art historian, even though I've tried to be. Sorry, what?
Yeah, you're in and out. But I was just thinking in response to that we've never talked about this, but we both had a similar assignment at the same time. And when I took the 4x5 camera to my boarding house where I lived in Cambridge, which was not probably 2 miles away from where Laura had her camera.
Yeah.
The power of that act, which, was first of all having to knock on a door of a stranger that lived next to me in a boarding house and then suggest, well, why was I making a photograph of them? I wasn't on a street, I was inside their home, their territory. And so my inclination right away was to bring that contact sheet back. And then secondly, say, so I'm looking at you, but does this have anything to do with you? And so the letters back and the writings they sent me back were the beginning of my experience of collaboration, right from the beginning, the distrust of the power of that lens over people and not for them in some way, and trying to wrestle that through for the next 50 years, as it were, almost.
Yeah.
I just find it funny, Laura, we've never talked about that intersection of that.
Yeah.
that object, that apparatus that both was the beginning for both of us and brought us back together again now in some ways.
That's really beautiful to hear, and to hear about the power of that kind of early moment of actually handling the equipment. I think too often when we find ourselves in positions where we're able to kind of speak to other colleagues about photography or to write about photography, too often we forget about those really sort of early formative experiences where we're kind of just there with the equipment going, how do I make sense of this? And we find ourselves in experiences with other people. And I suppose one of the things that I'm really curious about in the sort of assemblage of practices and projects that are being brought together through the Collaborations project is how you're able to, I suppose, mine information in relation to these projects, which isn't filtered through the authorial voice of the artist or the cultural organization or the critic. Because in many respects, certainly the authorial voice of the artist will always sort of affirm the artist's intentions and just still kind of tell one side of that story in that particular collaborative arrangement. So I just wondered what your thoughts were.
I would love to answer that first, because I think then Laura can give you a sense that we didn't even reference when we're making this book, the next layer that she'll tell you about. But I just want to say that Wendy and I, as the two practitioners amongst the five of us, for the most part, really wanted to make sure the photographer's voice was present. The subject was also as present as possible, and when appropriately, the representation of the forms, etc. But we're giving the reader the opportunity, be it in a gallery or an exhibition space or in a book space, to wrestle with those elements themselves, right? We're trying to give enough of a dynamic within the square or the project to, of course, there's more and one can dive in more, and we are generating that from, be it the books or online research. But Laura, maybe you can speak to the contributors text that the book will have, because that's a symphony, as you've said, which of voices, which I think you should mention at least.
Yeah, so there's 120 odd squares, and there's 120 odd contributors to whom we've sent the squares and asked them to respond to the square under the sign of the cluster text in the cluster. And so it's yet another voice, and these voices are the research. So what happens as you immerse yourself in this, you begin to realize that no one person has the key to the meaning of any of these life experiences, any of this being with others with cameras. No one person. And once you grasp that, you can start to see how directed we've been to listen to certain voices and not listen to others. And the enormous discoveries have happened for us when we've stopped listening to the voices that were the accredited voices and started saying, hey, yeah, but what about this other thing? And after 50 years, we are still learning new things. So what I would say is we have these 8 cluster texts, and we have an example of how we have worked with them. And we want to give it to the next generation of practitioners and students. And we want to say, we can guarantee that if you apply these cluster texts to these projects or others, something will happen. We can't guarantee what, and we can't guarantee to whom, and we can't guarantee when, but we can guarantee that something will happen. And that something will happen, that happens, will open the potential of photography in the future for you. That's what I would say in conclusion as to how this works and how we have worked with it.
Laura, that is a very beautiful point at which I bring this conversation to a close. And rather selfishly, I could monopolize your time for the rest of the evening and ask you so many more questions, but I hope to have another opportunity to do that.
I do want to jump in here to just say that we have 2 questions, and we can make just a little more time for those 2 questions from the audience. The first one is, could you perhaps speak a little bit about how you see the future of collaboration potentially opening up questions of authorship in photography? I think part of it was answered, but I wanted to ask this in that form.
I can't wait for that person to have this book in their hands, and I think they'll find their own answers, really. I think it opens up all the questions, and I mean, if it's the word provocation is the most appropriate question. You're authoring what? You know, what's the experience and what's the expression of the experience? Once you move from thinking about just making an object and you begin to think about relationships, and as Laura so beautifully talked about, everyone around the table having something important to say. And Anthony, your work this morning certainly spoke to that. And it's a discovery. It changes your practice. It opens up new ways of imagining. And I hope that it'll go, that's what we don't want this to seem authoritative in any sense. It's not a roadmap how to do it. It's much more a recipe book. It's much more, I think, encouraging that kind of engagement, and everyone will find their own answers.
And then the second question was, how can we increase the viability of collaboration in journalistic spaces where it is often expected that a supposedly objective individual is presenting what they've seen with no intended outcome or community engagement attached?
That is such an interesting question, and I'm sure Susan and Laura, you have something to say about this, but I'd just like to jump in and suggest to the person asking this question and everyone else to look at the kind of the new generation of news media channels that has evolved, certainly here in the UK, like Tortoise or the Bristol Cable. These kind of news channels which are membership based, where the journalists spend time undertaking slow journalism to kind of co-write articles with the subjects of the stories. There are kind of other models out there which certainly apply to the written word and also apply to the photographic practice as well.
Yeah, I think that's great to say, Anthony. Another project that we have, we're on in the works of gathering material from is Media Ninja, based in Brazil. Another great example of collective work. Changing all these institutions, I think, this is a much longer conversation where there are opportunities to work differently, creating alternative frameworks of working, but the traditional institutions that exist with hierarchies, you're very lucky as a photographer if the picture editor even asks you or respects the caption that you wrote. You're very lucky if they, etc. I think that would be a downer to go down that trail at the moment. I'd love to think more in that kind of, how do we reinvent, recondition ourselves to rethink and challenge the institutions that we are working within, all of them, including Beyond Magnum. Thank you very much, Shannon and Pauline, for
Thank you,
part of this. Because this to me is only part of our process, is, we're part of that process too.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Can I ask, and sorry, you may have said, but people are absolutely excited to get their hands on the book. When is that going to be available?
In theory,
Maybe in a year.
For the fall of 2022. I mean, it depends how well we work this summer. We're in review. We've delivered half. We're in review, and then there are the mechanisms of our partner Thames and Hudson. But of course, there's a lot of work involved in still reviewing, and additional materials.
Yeah, we're going to share the manifesto.
Yeah, the manifesto is available now. So there is that we can share now. Yeah.
Watch out for that in your email. Absolutely.
And we are still open, so we'll have that conversation with you, Anthony, and with others if there are ideas that you think we should know about that we may have missed. It's obviously, Laura mentioned this, but it's not chronological, though it does draw on a long history. It's not specifically organized geographically, though we try to be as broad-based as we can be. So we're still making discoveries, and hope to up until the brutal end in which all the files are sent off.
But it sounds like it's a project that could potentially occupy you all for the rest of your lives.
Better not.
That's why a fixed form of a book is such whose idea was that anyway?
Or the box. I look forward to seeing the box.
The box is the way to go. And the box can be additive, and that's why we're excited about the box. So we're working towards the box.
I love the idea, as I think you mentioned, handing it to the next generation and seeing what they make of it. So what
Well,
a
the
beautiful
next
idea.
generation is also in it, Shannon. There are
Mm,
quite a lot of next generation thinking, I think,
Yeah.
onward going forward. So yeah, a
Yeah.
lot to discover.
Great.
Sorry.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Anthony, Susan,
you.
Laura, Pauline, for your time. That was incredible.
Thank you all so much. This
Thanks.
was perfect. Yes. Thank
Thanks.
you.
And thank you to everyone for joining us, and we'll see you tomorrow at
See you
3
tomorrow.
o'clock
See you tomorrow. See you tomorrow.
UK time.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.